The wind came down off Mount Jefferson in sheets that October morning, carrying with it the first real bite of winter. It was 1979, and a young forestry student named Marcus Hollis had left the trailhead at Pamelia Lake before dawn, telling no one where he was going. He carried a daypack, a topographic map, and a disposable camera he'd bought at a roadside gas station. By nightfall, when he failed to return to his dormitory at Oregon State University, no one thought much of it. Marcus was known for losing track of time in the wilderness, but when 2 days passed, then 3, the calls started coming in. By the time searchers mobilized, the weather had turned. Snow blanketed the ridges above 5,000 feet, and visibility dropped to near zero. The search lasted 11 days before being scaled back to periodic sweeps. Marcus Hollis became another name on the missing persons list, another face on a poster tacked to the bulletin board at the ranger station. His family held out hope for years, but eventually the case went cold. Decades passed. The trail he walked was rerouted. The trees grew taller, and then, in 2014, a trail maintenance crew cutting through dense undergrowth near the base of Triangulation Peak found something that would reopen the case and raise questions no one could answer. A weathered skeleton clutching a rusted camera, surrounded by stones arranged in patterns that defied any known explanation. If you're watching this from somewhere out there, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. And if stories like this pull you in the way they pull me in, hit that subscribe button. This one's going to take us deep. The discovery happened on a Tuesday morning in late June. 2 Forest Service workers, clearing brush along an old spur trail that had been abandoned since the early 90s, noticed a patch of ground where the undergrowth seemed artificially thin. Beneath a rotting tarp, weighted down by rocks, they found what remained of Marcus Hollis. The bones were scattered slightly by animals, but the skeleton was largely intact, positioned in a semi-reclined posture against the base of a Douglas fir. What made them stop, what made one of them radio back to the ranger station immediately, was the arrangement of stones around the remains. Smooth river rocks, each roughly the size of a fist, had been placed in deliberate geometric patterns, concentric circles, radiating lines, clusters of 3 arranged in perfect triangles. The patterns extended outward from the body in every direction, covering an area roughly 15 feet in diameter. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office dispatched a forensic recovery team the following morning. Detective Laura Kemp, who had worked missing persons cases in the Cascades for nearly 2 decades, arrived with a forensic anthropologist and a crime scene photographer. What they documented over the next 6 hours would become the central enigma of the investigation. The skeleton was photographed in situ before any disturbance. The camera, still clutched in the skeletal right hand, was carefully extracted and bagged as evidence. The stones were photographed from multiple angles, and their positions were mapped using a grid system and GPS coordinates. Kemp noted in her initial report that the stones appeared to have been placed with intention, but the purpose or meaning behind the patterns was unclear. The forensic anthropologist confirmed what dental records would later prove conclusively. These were the remains of Marcus Hollis. The hyoid bone showed no fractures. There were no signs of blunt force trauma on the skull or long bones. The ribs showed no evidence of puncture wounds. Cause of death at that stage was undetermined, but there was nothing to suggest foul play. What was unusual, however, was the level of preservation in certain items found with the body. The daypack, though weathered and torn, had protected several items from complete degradation. Inside were remnants of a topographic map, a water bottle corroded beyond recognition, a flashlight with batteries that had long since leaked, and a small, spiral-bound notebook. The pages of the notebook were water-damaged and fragile, but some of the writing was still legible. Kemp brought the notebook back to the lab, where it was carefully dried and photographed under controlled conditions. The entries were sparse and fragmented, written in pencil that had faded unevenly. The first few pages contained mundane observations, trail conditions, elevation gains, species of trees and birds Marcus had identified. There was an entry dated October 12th, 1979, the day he went missing, describing his ascent toward Triangulation Peak. He noted clear skies and good visibility. He mentioned wanting to reach the ridge before sunset to capture photographs of the alpine glow. Then, abruptly, the tone shifted. An entry dated October 13th read, "Lost the trail, compass acting strange. Trying to descend, but the terrain doesn't match the map." Another entry, undated, simply said, "Heard something, not an animal." The final entries were almost illegible, but one phrase appeared multiple times across several pages. "They're watching." The phrase sent a chill through the investigative team, but Kemp remained cautious. Hypothermia, she knew, could cause hallucinations and paranoia. Dehydration and exhaustion could warp perception. The notebook alone wasn't enough to draw conclusions. The real breakthrough, if there was going to be one, would come from the camera. The camera was a Kodak Instamatic, a cheap model popular in the late 70s. The film cartridge inside had been exposed to moisture and temperature fluctuations for 35 years, and the likelihood of recovering any usable images was slim. Kemp contacted a forensic imaging specialist in Portland who had experience recovering degraded photographic evidence. The specialist warned that even with advanced chemical treatments, the results might be inconclusive. But Kemp insisted. The camera was transported under climate-controlled conditions, and the film was extracted in a darkroom over the course of several days. Of the 12 exposures on the roll, only 4 yielded partial images. The first was a landscape shot, slightly overexposed, showing a dense stand of hemlocks and a rocky outcrop in the distance. The second was a self-portrait, Marcus, smiling faintly, with the forest blurred behind him. The third image was darker, harder to interpret. It appeared to show the ground at night, illuminated by the weak beam of a flashlight. Scattered across the dirt were stones, smooth, rounded, identical in size to the ones found around his remains. The fourth and final image was the most unsettling. It showed a close-up of Marcus's own hand, palm open, fingers splayed. On the palm, drawn in what appeared to be charcoal or ash, was a symbol, 3 interlocking circles forming a triangular pattern. Beneath his hand, partially visible in the frame, were more stones arranged in the same radiating pattern documented at the recovery site. Kemp studied the photographs for hours. The timeline didn't make sense. If Marcus had arranged the stones himself, why? If he'd been injured or disoriented, why would he spend his energy constructing geometric patterns in the dirt? And if someone else had been with him, why was there no evidence of a second person? The tarp found over his remains suggested that someone had attempted to cover the body, but forensic analysis of the tarp indicated it had been placed there relatively recently, within the last 10 to 15 years, not in 1979. That suggested someone had discovered the remains long before the Forest Service crew, someone who had chosen not to report it. The investigation expanded. Kemp interviewed the 2 Forest Service workers who made the discovery. Both were credible. Both had worked the trails for years, and neither had any connection to Marcus Hollis or his family. She contacted historians and anthropologists to determine if the stone patterns matched any known indigenous symbology or geological survey markers. The consensus was no. The patterns didn't correspond to any documented cultural practices in the region, and they weren't consistent with any surveying or trail marking conventions. One anthropologist suggested they might be the work of someone attempting to mimic ceremonial arrangements, but without cultural context, the interpretation was speculative at best. Kemp also revisited the original search records from 1979. The search had been coordinated by the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office and the U.S. Forest Service. Helicopter sweeps had covered the area around Pamelia Lake and the ridges leading up to Mount Jefferson. Ground teams had worked grid patterns through the lower elevations, and search dogs had been deployed along the main trails. But the spur trail where Marcus was eventually found had not been thoroughly searched. It was off the main route, overgrown even then, and the assumption had been that a solo hiker would stick to established paths. That assumption, Kemp realized, had been wrong. She reached out to the original search coordinator, a retired ranger named Donald Pruitt, who now lived in Bend. Pruitt remembered the case clearly. He described Marcus's family, his mother, his younger sister, his father, who had driven up from California and stayed in a motel for 3 weeks, refusing to leave until the search was officially suspended. Pruitt recalled the frustration of those weeks, the sense that Marcus was close, that they were missing something obvious, but the weather had been unforgiving and resources were limited. Eventually, the decision was made to scale back. Pruitt admitted that it haunted him, that case. He asked Kemp if they'd figured out what happened. Kemp told him they were still working on it. Back at the lab, Kemp focused on the notebook. She brought in a linguist and a psychologist to analyze the handwriting and phrasing. The linguist noted that the handwriting remained consistent throughout the entries, suggesting Marcus had been coherent when he wrote them. There was no evidence of delirium or cognitive breakdown in the structure of the sentences. The psychologist pointed out that the phrase "they're watching" could indicate acute stress or paranoia, but without additional context, it was impossible to determine whether Marcus had been experiencing a psychological episode or responding to a genuine external threat. The question of who or what they referred to remained unanswered. Kemp decided to release some of the findings to the public, hoping that media coverage might generate new leads. She held a press conference in late August, explaining that the remains of Marcus Hollis had been recovered and that the investigation was ongoing. She described the stone patterns and the symbols found on the camera film, but she withheld certain details, the specific wording of the notebook entries, the image of the symbol on Marcus's palm. Within days, the story went viral. True crime forums dissected every available detail. Theories ranged from the plausible to the absurd. Some suggested Marcus had encountered a survivalist cult operating in the backcountry. Others proposed he'd stumbled onto illegal activity, a drug operation, a weapons cache, and had been silenced. A few voices inevitably speculated about paranormal encounters or government experiments. Kemp ignored the noise and focused on the evidence. One lead came from an unexpected source. A woman named Claire Dennison contacted the sheriff's office, claiming she had hiked the area in the early 80s and had encountered something strange. Kemp agreed to meet her at a coffee shop in Salem. Claire, now in her 60s, described an experience from the summer of 1982. She and her then-boyfriend had been backpacking near Triangulation Peak when they came across a small clearing where stones had been arranged in patterns on the ground. She remembered feeling uneasy, sensing that the arrangement was deliberate but not understanding its purpose. Her boyfriend had taken a photograph, but the print had been lost years ago. Claire said she'd thought about that clearing many times over the years, especially after reading about Marcus's case. She wondered if there was a connection. Kemp asked Claire to describe the location as precisely as she could. Claire sketched a rough map indicating a ridge roughly half a mile southwest of where Marcus's remains had been found. Kemp organized a field expedition. She brought along a GPS unit, a metal detector, and a small team, including a forensic geologist. They hiked up to the ridge Claire had described, and after an hour of searching, they found the clearing. The stones were still there, partially overgrown but unmistakably arranged in the same radiating pattern documented at Marcus's site. The geologist examined the stones and determined they were river rocks, likely carried up from Pamelia Creek. Whoever had placed them had done so deliberately, transporting them over difficult terrain. Kemp felt a shift in her understanding. This wasn't an isolated incident. Someone, possibly Marcus, possibly someone else, had been creating these patterns over a span of years, possibly decades. But why? And who? She returned to the lab and re-examined the tarp found over Marcus's remains. Forensic analysis had dated it to the late 90s or early 2000s, but there was one detail she'd overlooked: a small manufacturer's label on the corner. She traced the label to a company that had produced tarps for agricultural use, sold primarily through regional farm supply stores. She contacted the company, which provided a list of retailers in Oregon. It was a long shot, but she started calling, asking if anyone remembered unusual purchases or customers who might have been buying tarps for non-agricultural purposes. Most leads went nowhere, but one store owner in Sisters, a small town near the Cascades, remembered a man who used to come in regularly in the early 2000s. The man bought tarps, rope, and batteries. The store owner described him as quiet, polite, middle-aged, always paid in cash. He said the man mentioned he was working on a project in the backcountry, something about marking trails. Kemp asked if the store owner could provide a description. The man was white, average height, greying hair, usually wore flannel shirts and hiking boots. It wasn't much, but it was something. Kemp pulled permits for trail maintenance and research projects in the Jefferson wilderness from the late 90s through the 2000s. One name appeared multiple times: Dr. Alan Richter, a retired geologist from Portland State University who had been conducting an independent study on glacial erratic distribution in the Cascades. Kemp tracked Richter down through university records. He was living in a modest cabin outside of government camp. She drove up on a cold morning in October, almost exactly a year after the press conference. Richter answered the door warily. He was in his 70s now, thin and weathered, with the cautious demeanor of someone who valued solitude. Kemp introduced herself and explained why she was there. Richter listened, then invited her inside. The cabin was sparse. Bookshelves lined with geology texts, maps pinned to the walls, a wood stove crackling in the corner. Kemp asked him directly, had he ever come across the remains of Marcus Hollis? Richter was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. He said he'd found the remains in 2003 during one of his surveys. He'd been off-trail, following a drainage near Triangulation Peak, when he'd stumbled onto the site. The skeleton was partially exposed, and the stones were arranged around it just as Kemp had described. Richter said he'd known immediately that this was something significant, something that should be reported, but he hadn't reported it. He explained, with evident guilt, that he'd been dealing with personal issues at the time: a divorce, financial problems, a growing sense of isolation. He'd convinced himself that reporting the remains would lead to questions he didn't want to answer, complications he couldn't handle. Instead, he covered the site with a tarp he'd been carrying, intending to come back later and do the right thing. But he never did. Kemp asked about the stones. Richter said he hadn't touched them, hadn't added to them or altered them in any way. They were already there when he found the site. He assumed Marcus had arranged them, though he couldn't fathom why. Kemp asked if Richter had seen similar patterns elsewhere. Richter hesitated, then admitted he had. Over the years, while conducting his surveys, he'd come across several sites where stones had been arranged in geometric patterns. He'd documented them in his field notes, photographed them, but he'd never connected them to Marcus's case because he hadn't known who Marcus was. He'd assumed they were the work of other hikers, some kind of trail art or meditation practice. Kemp asked to see the field notes. Richter retrieved a stack of spiral-bound notebooks from a shelf. He flipped through them, showing Kemp sketches and photographs of stone arrangements he'd documented over a span of 15 years. There were at least a dozen sites scattered across the Jefferson wilderness, all featuring similar patterns: concentric circles, radiating lines, triangular clusters. Kemp felt a chill. This was bigger than she'd realized. Someone had been creating these patterns for years, possibly decades, long after Marcus's death. She asked Richter if he'd ever encountered anyone else at these sites. Richter said no, but he mentioned that on several occasions he'd had the unsettling feeling of being watched. He described it as a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, a sense that he wasn't alone even when the forest was silent. He dismissed it as paranoia, the result of spending too much time alone in remote areas. But now, hearing about Marcus's notebook entries, he wondered if there was something more to it. Kemp thanked Richter for his honesty and took copies of his field notes. She didn't charge him with obstruction or failure to report, given the circumstances and the time that had passed. It seemed pointless. But she did make it clear that if he remembered anything else, anything at all, he needed to contact her immediately. Richter agreed. Back in her office, Kemp spread out the field notes and cross-referenced the sites with topographic maps. The pattern that emerged was striking. The stone arrangements formed a rough arc across the Jefferson wilderness, spanning an area of roughly 30 square miles. At the center of the arc, almost perfectly equidistant from each site, was the location where Marcus's remains had been found. It was as if the arrangements radiated outward from that central point, marking a territory or delineating a boundary. But for what purpose? Kemp consulted with a cultural anthropologist who specialized in ritual behavior and land use. The anthropologist examined the photographs and maps, then offered a hypothesis. The patterns, she suggested, might be a form of memorialization, a way of marking sacred or significant space. In some cultures, stone arrangements are used to honor the dead, to create a connection between the physical and spiritual realms. But the anthropologist also noted that the patterns didn't conform to any known funerary tradition. They were too geometric, too precise, almost clinical in their execution. If they were meant as memorials, they were unlike any the anthropologist had encountered. Another possibility, the anthropologist suggested, was that the patterns were a form of communication. In environments where written language is impractical or impossible, symbols and spatial arrangements can convey messages across time. Perhaps someone had been using the stones to signal to others, to mark locations or convey information. But again, without a key or context, the messages were indecipherable. Kemp returned to the photographs from Marcus's camera. The image of his palm, marked with the interlocking circles, haunted her. She'd shown it to experts in symbology and semiotics, but no one could definitively identify the symbol. It didn't match any known alchemical, Masonic, or occult iconography. It didn't correspond to any Native American or prehistoric petroglyph forms documented in the region. It was, as far as anyone could tell, unique. Then, in early 2015, Kemp received a phone call from a forensic pathologist who had been reviewing the autopsy records. The pathologist had noticed something in the skeletal analysis that hadn't been flagged initially: a small healed fracture on the left ulna, likely sustained several years before death. The fracture itself wasn't significant, but while examining the X-rays more closely, the pathologist had spotted faint linear markings on the surface of several bones. The markings were superficial, not deep enough to indicate trauma, and they'd been overlooked in the initial examination. The pathologist suggested bringing the remains back for a more detailed forensic review. Kemp authorized the re-examination. Under high magnification, the markings became clearer. They were shallow grooves, etched into the bone surface in patterns that resembled the interlocking circles found on Marcus's palm. The grooves were old, consistent with marks made around the time of death, and they appeared on the ulna, the femur, and 2 ribs. The pathologist concluded that the marks had been made post-mortem, likely with a sharp tool such as a knife or a piece of metal. They were deliberate, purposeful, not the result of animal activity or environmental erosion. The implication was staggering. Someone had carved symbols into Marcus's bones after he died. Whether Marcus had done this himself in a final act of desperation or delirium, or whether someone else had done it, remained unclear, but it suggested a level of intentionality that contradicted the hypothesis of accidental death or simple exposure. Kemp convened a meeting with the forensic team, the anthropologist and a criminal psychologist. They reviewed all the evidence, the notebook entries, the camera images, the stone patterns, the bone markings, Richter's field notes. The psychologist proposed a theory. Marcus, lost and disoriented, had begun experiencing acute psychological distress. In an attempt to regain a sense of control or meaning, he'd started creating the stone patterns, perhaps as a way to mark his location, perhaps as a ritualistic response to fear. The symbols might have been a personal system, a way of externalizing his internal state. The phrase, "they're watching," could have been a manifestation of paranoia, a projection of his own anxiety onto the environment. As hypothermia set in, his cognitive function deteriorated, but the compulsion to create and mark persisted. It was a plausible explanation, but Kemp wasn't entirely convinced. The bone markings, she felt, complicated the narrative. If Marcus had been delirious or dying, how would he have had the strength or clarity to etch symbols into his own bones? And why would he? The psychologist acknowledged the inconsistency, but suggested that post-mortem changes, including insect activity or chemical interactions, might have created marks that appeared deliberate but weren't. Kemp decided to take one more step. She contacted a forensic entomologist to review the recovery site and the bone evidence. The entomologist examined photographs of the remains and the surrounding environment. He noted that the site, sheltered by dense undergrowth and the tarp, would have provided a relatively stable microenvironment. Insect activity would have been present, but limited. The grooves on the bones, he confirmed, were inconsistent with typical insect or scavenger markings. They were too uniform, too linear. The entomologist agreed with the pathologist's conclusion: the marks were intentional. That left 2 possibilities. Either Marcus had carved the symbols himself, or someone else had. Kemp returned to Richter's field notes and the timeline of the stone arrangements. If someone else had been involved, that person would have needed access to the site over an extended period, possibly spanning decades. They would have needed knowledge of the terrain, the ability to navigate off-trail, and a reason, obsessive or otherwise, to continue creating the patterns long after Marcus's death. Kemp expanded the investigation to include historical records of missing persons and unexplained deaths in the Jefferson wilderness. She found 3 other cases from the 80s and 90s, hikers who had disappeared and whose remains had been found years later, all in remote areas, all under circumstances that were unusual but not overtly suspicious. In none of those cases had stone arrangements been documented, but Kemp wondered if they'd simply been overlooked. She contacted the families of those individuals, asking if they'd ever heard of anything strange in the areas where their loved ones were found. One family mentioned that a Forest Service crew had found stacked rocks near the recovery site, but hadn't thought much of it. Kemp requested the original case files and found a single photograph, taken decades earlier, showing a cluster of stones arranged in a triangular pattern. The connection was tenuous, but it was there. Kemp began to construct a hypothesis. Over the past 40 years, someone, possibly a single individual, possibly a small group, had been moving through the Jefferson wilderness, creating stone arrangements at sites of death or disappearance. The purpose remained unclear, but the behavior was consistent. Whether this person had been involved in the deaths themselves or was simply memorializing them after the fact was impossible to determine without more evidence. In late 2015, Kemp received an anonymous letter. It was postmarked from Bend, handwritten on plain paper, no return address. The letter was brief. "The stones are memory. Marcus understood. Look at the ridgeline west of Hunt's Cove. You'll find the last one." Kemp traced the postmark, but couldn't identify the sender. She organized another field expedition, this time to Hunt's Cove, a remote drainage on the western edge of the wilderness area. The hike took 2 days. On the second afternoon, they reached the ridgeline described in the letter. There, in a small clearing surrounded by ancient hemlocks, they found the final stone arrangement. It was larger than the others, more elaborate, with stones forming overlapping circles and radiating lines that extended nearly 20 feet. At the center was a single flat stone, smooth and weathered. Carved into its surface, worn but still legible, was a date, October 12th, 1979. Kemp stood in the clearing as the light faded, trying to make sense of it all. Marcus had died here, or near here, lost and alone, creating patterns in the dirt as a way to impose order on chaos. Someone, years later, had found him and chosen to honor him, or perhaps to use him, as the center of something larger, something that defied easy explanation. The stones were memory, the letter had said. Memory of what? Of Marcus? Of others who had been lost? Of something else entirely? Kemp returned to the lab and filed her final report. The cause of Marcus Hollis's death was determined to be exposure, complicated by dehydration and hypothermia. The stone arrangements and symbols remained unexplained, but were classified as post-mortem memorialization by an unknown individual or individuals. The case was officially closed, though Kemp noted in her report that questions remained unanswered. Marcus's remains were returned to his family. His mother had passed away years earlier, but his sister held a small memorial service in Portland. She thanked Kemp for bringing him home. She said she'd always known, somehow, that he was still out there, waiting. She didn't ask about the stones or the symbols. Kemp didn't offer. In the months that followed, Kemp continued to receive occasional reports of stone arrangements in the Cascades. Hikers would stumble onto clearings where rocks had been placed in careful patterns, and they'd post photographs online, asking if anyone knew what they meant. Kemp monitored these reports but didn't pursue them actively. The patterns had become part of the landscape, a mystery woven into the wilderness itself. On a quiet afternoon in early winter, Kemp drove back up to the ridge where Marcus's remains had been found. The trail was empty, the forest silent. She stood at the site, now marked only by the faint depression where the stones had been. She thought about the phrase from Marcus's notebook, "They're watching," and wondered if he'd meant it literally or metaphorically. She thought about the person who had written the anonymous letter, who had continued to create the patterns for years, perhaps decades, driven by something she couldn't fully understand. Obsession, grief, guilt, devotion, maybe all of those things at once. She thought about memory and how we struggle to preserve it, to mark it, to make it visible in a world that erases us all eventually. The stones, she realized, were an attempt to resist that erasure, to say that someone had been here, that they had mattered, that they should not be forgotten. Whether Marcus had started that process, or whether someone else had taken it up in his name, the intent was the same. It was defiant and tender and deeply, achingly human. Kemp left the ridge as the first snow began to fall. She didn't return again. Years later, in 2019, a graduate student conducting field research on alpine vegetation, stumbled onto a new stone arrangement near the summit of Three-Fingered Jack, miles north of the Jefferson Wilderness. The pattern was familiar, concentric circles, radiating lines, but there was something new. At the center, someone had placed a small metal capsule, the kind used for geocaching. Inside was a slip of paper with a single handwritten sentence, "For those who are still looking." The student reported the find to the Forest Service. By the time a ranger reached the site, the capsule was gone. The stones remained. The story of Marcus Hollis and the symbols that surrounded his death has become part of the folklore of the Cascades, a mystery that invites speculation but resists resolution. Some believe the patterns are the work of a single individual, a hermit or wanderer who moves through the wilderness marking sites of loss. Others think the patterns have been adopted by multiple people over time, a shared language without words. A few inevitably cling to explanations that venture beyond the rational, echoes of ancient rituals, connections to forces beyond human understanding. Kemp, when asked in interviews, remains measured. She believes the evidence points to human agency, to someone who found meaning in the act of marking and memorializing. But she also acknowledges that some questions may never have answers. What do you think happened out there in 1979? Was Marcus trying to leave a message, or was he simply trying to hold on to his sanity as the cold closed in? And who spent years, maybe a lifetime, continuing what he started? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. And if this story made you pause, made you wonder, hit that subscribe button. There are more mysteries out there waiting to be told.